For 8 years, Eleanor lived with the ghost of the family she'd lost and the suspicion that came with being the only one left. The official report said her husband, Alistair, took their 3 children on a cross-country trip and simply vanished, a theory that painted him as a monster and her as a possible accomplice. But when a highway maintenance crew finds a shattered red cooler in a drainage ditch, a cooler she recognizes from the last photo ever taken of her family, it ignites a desperate hope that the truth is far more sinister than the police ever imagined. This story is a difficult one, and as we go through it together, I'm curious to hear what you think really drives a person to keep searching against all odds. Let us know your thoughts as the mystery unfolds. The silence in Eleanor's small house was a living thing. It had weight and texture, and after 8 years, it had become her most constant companion. It was a silence carved out by the absence of laughter from her 10-year-old Clara and the playful arguments of her 7-year-old twins, Leo and Finn. Most of all, it was a silence shaped by the specter of her husband, Alistair. The world remembered him as the man who drove his family into oblivion, the quiet dispatcher who supposedly snapped and disappeared. But Eleanor remembered the man who made pancake animals on Sunday mornings and who could spend hours helping Clara with a school project. Their separation had been quiet and mutual, a slow drifting apart that lacked the drama the police and media craved. They were planning to tell the kids after the road trip, a trip Alistair had insisted on taking to give them one last perfect family memory. Eleanor had stayed behind for work, a decision that would later be twisted into an indictment of her character. The whispers in the grocery store aisles, the pitying looks that felt more like judgment, they had become the soundtrack to her life. She'd lost her family, and in their place, she'd inherited a cloud of suspicion that never fully dissipated. So when the phone rang on a Tuesday morning, she expected it to be a telemarketer or a wrong number. Instead, it was a young state trooper, his voice professional but tinged with an unfamiliar kindness. His name was Deputy Rivas. He spoke carefully, explaining that a road crew clearing brush along a remote stretch of Highway 82 had found something, a broken red and white cooler wedged deep in the mud of a concrete culvert. He said it looked like it had been there for a very long time. "We found an abandoned vehicle registered to your husband about 50 miles from this spot, 8 years ago," Rivas said. "We cross-referenced items from the old case file. The description matches. I know it's a long shot, Mrs. Calloway, but would you be willing to come take a look?" Every cell in Eleanor's body went cold. The cooler. It was in the last picture she had of them, taken just before they left. The 4 of them were gathered around a picnic table, smiling. Alistair had his arm around Clara, and the twins were making funny faces. The red cooler sat on the table, a bright, cheerful beacon in a photo that now felt like a memorial. The drive out to the highway felt surreal. The world was moving on. Trucks thundered past, cars zipped by. But for Eleanor, time was rewinding. Rivas met her at a dusty pull-off. The cooler sat on the tailgate of his truck, looking pathetic and broken. One side was caved in, with a large crack running through the Coleman logo. It was caked in mud, but through the grime she could see them. The faint outlines of a sparkly unicorn sticker and a dinosaur sticker. Clara's additions. "It's theirs," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Her hand trembled as she reached out and touched the cracked plastic. It was real. After 8 years of nothing, here was something. A tangible piece of that last day. The other officers on the scene were dismissive. To them, it was just more trash from a cold case, debris left behind by a man who fled his life. They saw it as confirmation of the old story. But Eleanor saw a clue. A man running away doesn't leave a cooler full of food and drinks to rot in a ditch 50 miles from his van. Something had happened right here, on this lonely stretch of road. She asked if she could keep it. After she signed a form releasing the department of any responsibility, they agreed. It was just junk, after all. As she lifted the broken cooler into her trunk, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The police had given up. The world had moved on. But she wouldn't. This cooler was the first thread, and she was going to pull on it until the whole ugly truth unraveled. Back in her garage, Eleanor laid an old tarp on the floor and began the meticulous task of cleaning the cooler. She worked with a strange reverence, scrubbing away years of dirt and grime as if performing a sacred ritual. The smell of mud and stagnant water filled the air, but she barely noticed. As she cleaned the inside, her fingers brushed against something odd on the bottom panel. A slight ridge, an unevenness that didn't feel like part of the original design. Her heart began to beat faster. She grabbed a flathead screwdriver from Alistair's old toolbox and carefully inserted it into the seam. With a soft pop, the panel came loose. It was a false bottom. Her breath hitched. Inside, wrapped in a thick, discolored plastic bag, was a small bundle. With trembling hands, she unwrapped it. There were 2 items, a cheap, brick-like burner phone and a small, spiral-bound notebook. The phone was almost certainly dead, its charging port corroded. But the notebook, the ledger, was mostly intact. She opened it, and a wave of emotion washed over her as she saw Alistair's neat, precise handwriting. It was filled with dates, truck numbers, and cargo descriptions. Next to these entries were names and notes about discrepancies. He had been a dispatcher for Redwood Freight, a regional hauling company. The notes detailed inconsistencies between what was listed on the official manifests and what he knew was actually on the trucks. Words like undeclared pharmaceuticals and unmarked electronics were circled. The monster father, the man who supposedly abandoned his family, was gone. In his place was a whistleblower, a meticulous, brave man who was documenting a crime. And Eleanor knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that his discovery had gotten him killed. She tried to charge the phone, but it was hopeless. The device was a fossil. The ledger was her only hope. She knew she couldn't go back to the local sheriff's department. The original investigation had been led by Sheriff Davis, a man who had looked at her with cold, accusatory eyes from the very beginning. He had closed the case with what felt like relief, eager to accept the simple narrative of a family man who broke. Taking this to him would be like handing it to the enemy. She needed an ally. The next morning, she drove to the offices of the local newspaper, the Clarion. It was a small operation, struggling like most print media. The older journalists she spoke to gave her the same tired, pitying look she knew so well. Her story was ancient history. But a younger reporter, a man named Ben Carter, overheard her. He had a hungry look in his eyes, the look of someone tired of writing about town council meetings and county fairs. He was skeptical at first. He'd only moved to town a few years ago, but he knew the legend of the Calloway family. He listened patiently as Eleanor laid out her story, her voice steady as she presented the ledger. Ben flipped through the pages, his skepticism slowly melting away, replaced by a reporter's instinct. Alistair's notes were too detailed, too consistent to be the ramblings of a troubled mind. "Redwood Freight," Ben said, tapping a finger on the cover of the notebook. "They're one of the biggest employers in the county, owned by a guy named Marcus Thorne. He's got his hands in everything around here." Ben agreed to help. He told Eleanor he had a friend who was a tech wizard, someone who might be able to recover something, anything, from the water-damaged phone. While they waited, Ben started digging into Redwood Freight. It didn't take him long to uncover something that made Eleanor's stomach clench. Marcus Thorne, the powerful owner of the company Alistair was investigating, was also the single biggest donor to Sheriff Davis's last 2 election campaigns. The man who was supposed to investigate her family's disappearance was in the pocket of the man who likely had them killed. A few days later, Ben called. His friend had worked a miracle. The phone was destroyed, but he'd managed to recover a single data fragment from the SIM card, a corrupted audio file of a voicemail Alistair had tried to leave. The quality was terrible, filled with static and the sound of wind, like it was recorded from a moving car. But through the noise, they could just make out Alistair's strained voice. 3 distinct fragments were audible. "Highway 82, meeting, they know." The pieces slammed into place with brutal clarity. Alistair wasn't running away. He was driving to a meeting, likely with an FBI contact, to hand over his evidence. The meeting was on Highway 82, the same highway where the cooler was found. But someone at Redwood Freight had found out. They know. They weren't just missing. They had been intercepted. Eleanor and Ben sat in the small newspaper office, the weight of their discovery hanging in the air. This was no longer a cold case. It was an active conspiracy, and they had just poked the hornet's nest. Ben looked at Eleanor, his expression grim. "Thorne and Davis have run this county for years," he said quietly. "If we make a move, we have to be sure it's the right one. They won't hesitate to crush us." But Eleanor had lived in fear and suspicion for 8 years. She was done being quiet. "They took my family, Ben," she said, her voice low but filled with steel. "They don't get away with it." She had the evidence. She had an ally. Now she needed a plan. The only person who could connect Thorne to the crime was the man he owned, Sheriff Davis. And she was going to make him talk. With Ben's help, Eleanor arranged a meeting with Sheriff Davis at his office, saying she had a final statement to make about her husband's case before she could truly move on. Davis agreed, his tone dripping with condescending sympathy. Ben set up a small pinhole camera in a button on his own shirt, planning to record the entire encounter. His editor had agreed to set up a private live stream, visible only to him and the newspaper's lawyer. It was a risky move, but it was their only insurance policy. They walked into the sheriff's office the next day. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and cheap air freshener. Sheriff Davis sat behind his large wooden desk, the picture of small-town authority. He leaned back in his chair, a smug look on his face. "Eleanor," he said, using her first name with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "I'm glad you're finally ready to put this behind you." "I'm not here to put it behind me, Sheriff," Eleanor said, her voice steady. She placed the ledger on his desk. "I'm here to reopen it." Davis's smile vanished. He stared at the notebook, then up at Eleanor, his eyes narrowing. "What is this?" "It's my husband's work journal," she replied. He kept detailed records of the illegal cargo Redwood Freight was hauling. He was on his way to meet the FBI when you and Marcus Thorne had him stopped. A flicker of panic crossed the sheriff's face before he masked it with anger. "That's a ridiculous accusation," he blustered, his face turning red. "You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 8 years," Eleanor countered. "We also recovered a voicemail from a phone we found. A voicemail where Alistair says, 'They know.' He was talking about you, wasn't he?" At the mention of the phone, Davis lost his composure completely. He stood up, knocking his chair back. "This is evidence in an old case," he snapped, reaching for the ledger. "It belongs to this department. You are not to interfere with official police matters." As his hand closed around the notebook, Ben spoke up for the first time. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sheriff, because everything you're saying right now is being live-streamed directly to my editor." The color drained from Davis's face. He froze, looking from Ben's calm expression to the tiny lens on his shirt. He was trapped. The bluff, the anger, the authority, it all evaporated, leaving behind a scared, cornered man. "Thorne," he stammered. "It was Thorne's men. They handled it. I just kept things quiet." "Where is he?" Eleanor demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and grief. "His ranch," Davis whispered, slumping back into his chair, defeated. "He's at his ranch, north of town." Just then, the door to the office burst open. Ben's editor had alerted the state police as soon as he saw Davis start to crack. Troopers swarmed the building, their faces grim and professional. They took a stunned Sheriff Davis into custody, while Eleanor and Ben stood by. The raw truth of the past 8 years finally exposed to the light. They followed the convoy of state police cars as it sped out of town toward Thorne's ranch. It was a sprawling property, hidden behind a high gate and a long, winding driveway. A tense standoff followed, but Thorne, for all his money and power, was no match for a dozen armed state troopers. He surrendered without a fight, his face a mask of cold, arrogant indifference. It was one of Thorne's henchmen who finally told them the full story. He confessed everything in a sterile interrogation room. They had been tipped off about Alistair's plan to meet the feds. They'd used 2 trucks to force his minivan off the road on that isolated stretch of Highway 82. The cooler had flown out of the back during the crash, landing in the ditch where it lay hidden for years. They took Alistair and the children back to the ranch. The man's voice was flat, emotionless, as he recounted how Thorne had given the order. There could be no witnesses. His confession led the investigators to a quiet, wooded corner of the ranch. After 8 long years, Eleanor finally found her family. Days later, a press conference was held. Alistair Calloway was no longer a villain, but a hero. A man who had died trying to do the right thing. Eleanor stood at the podium, Ben by her side. She looked out at the faces of the townspeople, the same people who had whispered about her for years, and saw not judgment, but shame and regret. She spoke of her husband's quiet courage and her children's bright, unlived futures. Her voice didn't break. The final scene of her long nightmare took place at a cemetery, at a new gravesite marked by a single polished stone bearing 4 names. She placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the grass, the silence around her no longer feeling empty, but peaceful. The suspicion was gone, replaced by the heavy, certain weight of grief. But with that grief came a sense of closure. The world finally knew the truth. Her husband was not a monster. He was a good man, and she would make sure their children were remembered as the bright, loving souls they were, now and forever. If you discovered a dangerous secret that could put your family at risk, would you pursue justice like Alistair did? Or would you protect your loved ones by staying silent? We appreciate you spending time with this story today. If you'd like to support our channel and hear more stories like this, consider liking this video and subscribing for future narratives.